On your journey through life, you are the hero. There are times, however, when it is beneficial to have an advisor to guide you along your path. Welcome to the Smart Money Simplified podcast with Brent Mekosh, certified financial planner, certified investment management analyst, and co-founder of MP Advisors LLC. In this podcast, Brent discusses some of the most important and interesting topics of the day as they relate to finance, the economy, and beyond. Now, on to the show.
Hello and welcome to Smart Money Simplified with Brent Mekosh. Brent, how are you?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm here in Arizona, and I always like to rub it into people that are not in Arizona in
Like me.
February, almost March. It's probably 60, 65 degrees out, slightly different from where you are in Nebraska today.
Yeah, slightly different. It's freezing. It's just free. I mean, I think I told you it was negative 10 wind chill yesterday. Just ridiculous. So I hope you were ready for a roommate.
Well, I'll tell you, human beings were not made to exist in that climate, Eric. I'm telling you.
Yeah.
Got to come down here to the sunshine.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know that we could talk about this all day, but you've got Nate in studio today.
I do.
You've got a guest, and I'm interested to hear what you're talking about.
I'm really excited about this conversation. I've been on this kick lately, really talking to people that have breakthrough innovative technologies in healthcare. And Nate Hill's a territory manager at Ceribell. What they do is they develop portable EEG systems. They're basically like rapid response systems that are pretty game changing technology in ways that Nate's going to describe to us. And it really kind of builds on this theme from our last conversation about how, this sort of confluence of things between the mobile devices everyone has in their pockets, between the technology that's coming on, between the ability for AI to read some of these things, have come together to, I think, the future delivers some pretty fantastic healthcare to people in a variety of ways that hopefully it's going to be a lot more affordable and accessible as well. But we're going to dive into a lot of that stuff. But Nate, thank you. Thank you for joining me.
Absolutely.
And let's just start with this. So, all right, we can talk about EEG systems. We can talk about, mobile technology and healthcare and all that stuff. But give me a little bit of background in terms of who you are and how you got to where you are today.
Who I am. All right. So I've been fortunate enough to spend the vast majority of my career in medical device sales. Let's see, I started in 2005. I worked for a company called Boston Scientific, a very large company. Spent 7 years there, had a great time. From there, was able to join the company called Carl Storz as a sales leader. So I ran the West region as part of their airway management division. Great experience as well there too. From there, I was hired by a company called Bard, which has now become Becton Dickinson, initially as an IDN manager, but then transitioned. I was actually asked to move into a sales leadership role. I spent 6 years there. And then actually made a little bit of a left turn into software sales. And so worked for a local company based in Scottsdale that did not call on healthcare. This was a multifamily industry. And there was going to be a launching of an AI-based, a bot basically that conversed with lease prospects, and did that for 2 years. And that led me perfectly really to Ceribell, where it's a combination of the two, really. It's healthcare, but it's software as a subscription, SaaS, and there's an AI element to it, and really kind of marries what I did the last 2 years with LeaseHawk, and also what I did for the almost 16 years prior to that in medical device.
So tell me a little bit about the product that Ceribell's making right now.
Okay, it's rapid response EEG. Now I'm hesitating to say EEG because we refer to it more as a point of care, a brain monitor. There is a proper EEG that's captured with this, but it's really designed for really everybody but neurology within the hospital. And that, when I say everybody, it's everybody in the stat environment. So if it's the ED, the ICU, med surg floors, and it can be used by providers that don't normally handle neurological devices. And that's really the spirit behind it, is that, to take a step back, you, by comparison, want to understand, conventional EEG, and, conventional EEG, to read a conventional EEG, it requires a high level of expertise, normally owned by neurology. And so the workflow would be that if you're an ER physician in the ED and you had an altered patient that was presenting as if they might have non-convulsive seizures, that you were unsure, but you had a high level of clinical suspicion, you would order this out. And so that would require an order to the EEG team. With that, there has to normally be a neurology consult so that eventually when that EEG is performed, it would be read by a neurologist. And then you eventually get information that you could guide treatment with to the patient. And so that's all well and good. And that is the gold standard. And there's really no issues with that other than for these stat environments, the ED, the ICU, hospitalists on med surg floors. A lot of times they do have a high clinical suspicion, but they don't have time. They'll either have to put in the order and wait. And then in the interim, they'll treat that patient as if they are having non-convulsive seizures. So they'll give them anti-epileptic drugs, which again, that's gold standard treatment too. I'm not saying there's necessarily anything wrong with that, but that's kind of a, the practice acquiescing to the technology that's available.
Sure.
Right. EEG, there's a study that we refer to a lot called DECIDE, which has basically substantiated that the average time to EEG is 239 minutes. In the hospital,
a long time. If there's a problem, that's a long time.
It's 4 hours. Yeah. And it's, the 5 hospitals that were part of the study all had very robust EEG infrastructure. So it wasn't like they were ill-equipped. They were very highly equipped, actually much on the spectrum. They had much higher capabilities than most hospitals that we serve. But even they were taking just shy of 4 hours from order to EEG. And so what they realize is that, well, first of all, I've had physicians that were part of these trials tell us that they were actually surprised that it took that long. They probably would have told me prior to that they were getting EEGs quicker, but they were surprised by that length of time. And so what that leading back to why Ceribell was created was that there was this clinical gap. What do you do? So, I've ordered EEG because I have a clinical suspicion that there's irregular neurological activity happening here. And so until I get EEG, I have to treat this patient as if they have it just in case.
Right.
And that does actually lead to, it's not just the time, and it's not just unnecessarily treating something or somebody for something they don't have. You're also potentially having to add layers and layers of treatment based on that. Right. And so if I suspect I'm an intensivist, I already talked about ED. I say I'm an intensivist and you're presenting as if you're having seizures, then I'm going to treat you as if you're having seizures. Well, that will likely lead to an intubation and may have you in the ICU longer than had I not given you these highly sedative drugs. And so, and getting back to the spirit of why Ceribell was created is that there was an awareness that there was a clinical need to give faster, much quicker, but also reliable diagnostic information so that we can avoid unnecessary medications, unnecessary intubations, unnecessary admissions into the ICU, and to reduce a length of stay.
I think one of the things that's so cool about this technology is just, on a personal level, you've met my wife,
Yes.
also works at Mayo Clinic.
Yeah.
If she was sitting here, I'd say the same thing. Total, absolute hypochondriac. And so Mayo, it was a former Mayo doctor actually developed some technology for a portable echocardiogram, so EKG. And as opposed to every time you get a heart flutter or your heart skips a beat, the fact you can pull this thing out that is synced to your iPhone and says, okay, you've got a normal sinus rhythm, everything is good. It not only provides peace of mind, but in the event that there ever was an issue, if you could find out early, maybe that there was something wrong. I mean, that'd be pretty incredible.
Absolutely.
And so I think that in terms of what you're saying is that you're giving people that do not have this specialized knowledge that people in neurology would. You're giving them some tools to maybe not solve the problem, but to recognize it at what could be a critical time.
That's very astute. Yeah, that's well said. It gives them the ability to put the patient on the right path up front, as opposed to potentially treating them as if they have something they don't have, indeed, and then also adding more layers of complications and unnecessary treatment.
Got it.
Yeah.
And so your company, Ceribell, you guys were founded in 2014. So relatively new company.
Yeah.
Is there anyone else in your space that you're competing against?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, there are other companies that have since come forth with some solutions that I'm hesitating here because the short answer is not really, but there are some similar neurological conditions that are being targeted by other companies like ours, other smaller companies. But It might be where currently we're singularly focused on non-convulsive seizures. There are companies that are focusing on concussions or like brain bleeds or even brain death. But as far as any head-to-head competition as it relates to diagnosing non-convulsive seizures, we really don't have any competition.
For the traditional machines, and if you can try to describe, I guess, the difference between your product and traditionally how you're going to get an EEG. So 2 questions for you, I guess. The traditional machines, first of all, who makes them? Who's the big player in that space?
Natus, Neon Coden, those are the 2 biggest.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what does that look like? Somebody goes gets an EEG. What's the process?
Question. I love that you asked that question. So what it looks like today is what it looked like 70 years ago. The technology advancements with EEG, and I'm not trying to be too disparaging about it, but it just hasn't really changed. It's a big tower. A lot of times there are components to it that aren't used, but it's a comprehensive system that may have a monitor, a keyboard. It literally is electrodes that are glued to your scalp. So it requires shaving the patient's head first and gluing electrodes on, and they're it's been kind of a static technology that hasn't changed much, and so it looks kind of foreboding, to be honest with you.
I've seen pictures of these things.
Yeah.
And what's once you've ordered that, patient now has had their head shaved, electrodes strapped on, how long does the test take?
Oh, that's a good question too. So it depends on the unit that's ordering them. So they're most commonly ordered in the ICU. Now, it's funny. This conversation could take a totally different path. The ED isn't really suitable for conventional EEG. It's just not. The ED is a triage unit within the hospital to where they need to identify what the problem is and get that patient moving to the right.
And what is the ED?
The emergency department.
Okay.
Yeah. And so that, they could use EEG, and we're finding that our utilization is actually matched in the ED, with the ICU. But conventional EEG is almost never used in the ED because simply it's just not built for an environment that's really concerned with throughput, which is the ability to identify a patient's needs and get them in the right. And so
you just got to burn people through. Not to physicians out there that might be listening, but emergency medicine, the way I've always looked at it, right or wrong, is you got to kind of roll these people through. There's an emergency, they're there for a reason. You got to burn through that list as fast as you can and get them where they have to go. Yeah,
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
So getting back to answering your question, it's almost always going to happen in the ICU. So if you come in from the field into the ED, you're presenting as if you have altered mental status. You're presenting with altered mental status as if you may have non-convulsive seizures or some abnormal neurological condition. Usually the ED will admit you. If the ED doesn't have Ceribell, I should say, they would admit you into the ICU. So they would more than likely give you an anti-epileptic drug and give you a bed. And so at that point, that's where EEG is normally ordered. And so the bedside nurse will order EEG, will order the neurology consult. A lot of times those 2 have to go hand in hand, because you can't order a conventional EEG without knowing that you have a neurologist assigned to that EEG to read it. Because really, going back to what I was saying earlier in this conversation, only neurologists can interpret EEGs and give you diagnostic information, right? So you can to guide treatment. And so the bedside nurse receives the patient in the ICU. They'll order EEG. They'll order the neurology consult to make sure that it's going to be read, and then it's a waiting game. And look, a lot of hospitals do have a good EEG, conventional EEG coverage, to where they may get it, in an hour or 2, maybe even less. And then you hook it up, you perform the EEG. The EEG is read by the neurologist, and then that intensivist that's caring for you in the ICU will take that information to basically make treatment decisions at that point.
You might not have an answer to this, but someone shows up in the emergency department. They're showing symptoms that would lead you to say, okay, we're going to send you to ICU. We're going to order this test. It would obviously vary depending on where in the country you are, what the hospital is. What does it cost? And any idea from admittance in the emergency room through that test being complete and them sitting in traditional way and them sitting in the ICU?
So part of my job is to walk hospitals through an ROI that really identifies what it will cost them.
Yeah.
I can't really give you a number right now, but I can tell you the components of the ROI. The first thing is to have techs on hand to perform these procedures, right? And that's not a procedure, but to perform EEGs. You have to have them on hand. A lot of times they are on hand when hospitals do have EEG teams. They're on hand Monday through Friday, bankers hours 7 to 3, 8 to 4, so 40 hours a week.
Right.
And so that's the one piece of it there. Now, a little sidebar on that is that it kind of sounds like a lot, right? Like, 5 days a week, 8 to 4. Well,
what happens sometimes on Friday night?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's when you look at the patients don't conveniently have neurological issues Tuesday at 11 a.m. It can happen, to your point. And so, 40 hours a week leaves 128 hours uncovered. So it's not even 2 full days. When you think about that, 40 hours in a week. And so that's part of the ROI too, is that, like, what would it cost the hospital to have techs that, say they're not there outside of those bankers hours, but to your point, somebody comes in Friday night, Sunday morning, Christmas Day, whatever. What does it cost the hospital to have either techs on standby, or what are the on-call costs to get, an EEG to come in the middle of the night on a Saturday night? The other side of that too is that what does it cost when you don't have an on-call tech, right? What does it cost the hospital? Say they come in, Friday night.
Got to get
Anecdotally, I've heard so many. We had somebody come in at 5:30, and it's like, we're not going to have EEG until Monday morning. So that patient's going to get a bed and be on meds and really be on standby for almost 3 days at that point. What does that cost the hospital? And then,
what's the potential legal liability too down the road if you had somebody that was coming in, I don't know any of the answers to this, but showing symptoms, and it's Friday night and the test isn't actually administered until Monday morning, I would think that would open a medical provider up to some liability.
Yeah, and that's a good question. I can tell you, in my year plus with Ceribell, I haven't had any legal conversations about that. And now, and I would suspect that it's not necessarily a legal issue. I mean, these are empirical treatment, meaning to give a patient anti-epileptic drugs based on clinical suspicion. That's a gold standard treatment. That's not considered wrong or bad or anything like that. It's not malpractice. It's not negligent. It's just a hospital doing the best they can with the capabilities that they have.
Right.
But getting back to your question about cost, if that patient comes in on Friday, so many different ways this conversation could go, but they come in Friday night post normal EEG hours, they're going to have a bed and be on standby and be on meds until Monday morning. And then the process starts. So it's not like Monday morning, it's like, okay, we have diagnostic information, we're ready to go. At that point, it's going to be, okay, now let's get the EEG going. Let's get the neurology consult. Let's get the read. Let's find out what's really happening with this patient. And then the dominoes fall from there. I want to say another thing that's important too, as it relates to that. And so when you look at from an ROI perspective, there's also a dynamic that happens a lot, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the hospital, but they may elect to, as it relates to the ROI, another thing to consider too for hospitals is they may elect to ship out or, to transfer that patient. That's costly to the hospital too, because again, this is somebody coming in from the field. There's a clinical suspicion that they might have a neurological issue, and rather than be able to diagnose it themselves and then decide whether or not that patient is somebody they can keep, they'll just elect to ship that patient out. And, that's hospitals do not like to lose patients, especially ones that they could have cared for. Now, if that patient had higher needs than what that hospital's capabilities were, then by all means, that patient needs to be shipped out ASAP. And there should be no delay in that. But part of our value proposition is that with our diagnostic service, that they're able to keep the right patients, admit the right patients, not ship out and lose patients. There's a revenue side to that too. And that is happening. We hear there's so many different ways this can go, like I said, and I've probably said it like 3 times already, but as it relates to ROI, honing back to that, shipping out patients that a hospital could have cared for, it's very, 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 very painful. So I want to land the plane here, because the ROI question you ask is a good one. This is a clinical service. It's what's right for the patient, but the ROI isn't really strong. And we've probably only been through about half of what we normally go through. Yeah. We normally have singular focused meetings on ROI once there's a clinical understanding and buy-in, where we even bring in a third-party consultant to come in that can speak to reimbursement, coding, because there's an ROI with this too. Most of the stuff I've been talking about has been more avoiding unnecessary costs. there's also a revenue opportunity with properly diagnosing up front these patients that comes with using Ceribell. And that means that basically, since when hospitals bring on Ceribell, they're doing a lot more EEG. So where the emergency department wasn't doing EEGs before, now they're doing EEGs. So they're diagnosing disease states that weren't being diagnosed before, which if that patient, it's been substantiated that they do have seizures and they do get a bed in the ICU. Now we've basically validated how sick these patients are. And so they're the DRG, so like the overall the baseline revenue that goes to a lengthy ICU stay goes up because you're adding comorbidities and major comorbidities to that baseline revenue. So that's a part of it too. So maybe we can move on from the ROI thing, but I mean it was a very 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 good question. But it you and I could do a single podcast on the ROI side of this, because similar to how we, when we're targeting hospitals and hospitals are assessing whether or not they're going to bring in Ceribell, there are, like I said, singular focused meetings had on the ROI.
It's got to make sense. I mean, every, even nonprofit hospitals, they have to at least not run a gigantic loss,
Right.
So we live on, like it or not, we live on an economic planet, and all this stuff has to financially make sense.
Yeah.
And so, compared with your system, so you guys, I asked ChatGPT, by the way, I said, tell me about the Ceribell EEG system. It gave me eons of stuff, but it basically says it's disposable headband on the patient's head, so there's no shaving and nodes and all this other stuff.
No glue and razor blades.
Exactly. Yeah. It detects any abnormal activity, and it basically then transmits all this data to a mobile app on a smartphone or a tablet. And
no, not quite.
Okay.
Yeah, very, very, very close. So we issue our hospitals recorders that are basically like PDAs.
Okay.
And so, you're kind of right in that our portal can be accessed by smartphones.
Okay.
But that's more for a neurologist to either read a function that we provide called seizure burden, which is basically a numerical value on how much, if any, seizure activity the patient had, or to actually go in and read the EEG. What the bedside clinician gets at the bedside in real time is through the information they get, the data they get is through a handheld recorder.
Okay.
That's
it's your machine.
Yeah. And it's actually connected to the headband that's connected to the patient.
Got it. And in terms of putting this thing on, how long does it take to administer this test to somebody?
From start to finish, you can order Ceribell, put it on, and get diagnostic information within about 5 or 6 minutes.
5 or 6 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay.
It sometimes ordering it may take 5 minutes, but that has nothing to do with Ceribell. But once it's ordered and there's a decision made to okay, we're going to do a Ceribell study on this patient, then it's 30 seconds to put the headband on. Again, no shaving, glue, any of that. I mean, it's spandex. It's a one size fits all for adults. You put it on, you activate the electrodes, and you do have to wait up to 5 minutes for enough EEG data to upload and to be interpreted. And then that's it. And then it's not just that too. So, you get this upfront diagnostic information that tells you whether or not there's seizures happening with this patient, but you also, if there are seizures, it's left on, and it guides the bedside clinician for how they're going to be treating that patient going forward, right? And so it's very fluid in that sense. So it's a trend line that's constantly updating, and so if you detect seizures, you will treat and you will give some sort of anti-epileptic drug that will, break the seizure. And then, but you would more than likely leave it on in that case to see how that patient is responding to, first of all, to ensure that you actually broke the seizure activity that was happening, but then also to maybe guide future doses and future treatment. It can be used for up to 24 hours.
And so in the handheld, because you mentioned, obviously, you don't have people from neurology that know how to read the traditional reports.
Yeah.
People in the ER, they're pretty smart, whether nurse practitioners, whether the ER doctors, they can look at this data, and are they now getting some sort of an AI component from the device that is alerting them to, hey, here's abnormalities where maybe if a layperson looked at it, they wouldn't see it?
Well, I want to make sure I understand the question. Yeah. The whole idea of the interpreted EEG is so that anybody can understand.
So like I could, as not a medical professional, I could look at this thing and not know how to treat it or do anything else, but I could know there's something wrong.
100%. And that,
okay.
Yeah. So your question was spot on. Yeah. And so that's the idea, is that really the bedside clinician gets a numerical value, it's a percentage, and it's basically a rolling 5-minute snapshot. Okay. And that percentage is indicative of how much seizure activity during that rolling 5 minutes the patient had. And it updates every 10 seconds. So that numbers, if there is seizure activity, is going to be changing, almost constantly, if there is seizure activity. And so, and that's the idea between the numerical value and the trend line. That tells you what, if any, seizure activity that patient has. And then getting back to your question about the layperson, I mean, it's really just, the number and we give them a workflow. I shouldn't say we give them a workflow. We create a workflow with input from the physicians that dictates what they do with that data. It's not really Ceribell's place to say, oh, if it's, X amount, this is what you do.
Right.
But as part of our pre-launch process, we gather input from the emergency physicians, the intensivists in the ICU, and also the reading neurologists on the back end to basically say, okay, if it's 0 to 10, which is normal to very, very minimal, what is our plan? If it's 11 to 49 or even 11 to 89, so it's kind of in that middle zone, what is our plan? And then if it's 90 plus, that's a condition called status epilepticus. That's an absolute medical emergency that requires immediate attention. A lot of times leads to a neurology consult. And so it's really simplified, and from that standpoint, and this is something I get involved in. So we trained to this when we launch hospitals, because again, this is something that there's been input from the physicians. There's an alignment across the hospital as far as like what this workflow is, and so it's the device giving numerical data that shows them exactly how much seizure activity is happening, and then for them, it's one of 3 or maybe 4 at the most courses of action from getting that data.
Now, let's say someone is caring for a person that is having challenges with seizures. Is this device going to be for sale for the non-medical market, just the layperson as well?
We've had that question quite a bit. I shouldn't say quite a bit, but I personally have been asked that maybe about 6 times in a year, which is a fair amount, right? As it stands right now, there are no plans for home use or end user patient use.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it. So I guess another question is, all this stuff has to get paid for somehow. Are hospitals buying the device? Are they buying the software? What are they actually acquiring?
Good question. Yeah, no, it's a subscription. So it's similar to most software packages. Now, the one major difference at Ceribell, and I'm still blown away by this because I know firsthand how much goes into implementing it, is that there are no upfront implementation costs and there are no capital costs either. So we provide the equipment to go along with the service, and it's a subscription.
Okay, that's really cool.
We really bet on ourselves. I will say, from our perspective, it's a little labor intensive from our perspective. It's a little labor intensive to implement because we require so much input from so many different stakeholders within the hospital, and there are a lot of meetings where a lot of people are weighing in, and it's from a standpoint too of assuring understanding. It's a cross-functional solution, basically, that it touches so many different departments. It may start in one and end up in the other. In fact, it's common for Ceribell to be put on a patient in the emergency room and then have the Ceribell follow the patient into the ICU, right? And so we just have to touch so many
all departments,
all the departments, and all the players within the departments. And so it just requires a lot of upfront onboarding, training, again, input for the workflow. And then I spend the better part of 2 weeks with my launches.
So let me ask you this, because you've come from a background where you've been big medical corporate America. You're now with a relatively younger company, 8-10 years roughly.
Yeah.
Working with innovative, disruptive technology. How's it just different from your perspective, from going from like a Becton Dickinson or a company that they acquired, obviously, to Ceribell? Just aside from the product, give me a feel for what it's like to work on this sort of leading edge of the healthcare tech world.
That's a great question. I love it. It is vastly different. If I can go back to my younger self, I don't really have any regrets about my career, but the startup environment is entirely different than what I experienced at Boston Scientific and BD, even Carl Storz, which is kind of real, size-wise more like in the middle zone. They're definitely not a startup. They've been around for a while, but they're not quite as big as a Boston or a BD. But the startup environment is very fun. Things grow and change. You have to be nimble in the startup environment. I've been there a year, And I feel like I have seen a lot of change and growth to a very high level, and it's a lot of fun.
So what have you seen? One of the things we've seen, at least in my industry, is obviously 2020, 2021, even into very early 2022, people are throwing money at anything.
Mm-hmm.
That's changed a lot, in the last year or so.
Yeah.
Have you seen that, at least in whether it's with Ceribell or with other counterparts, that capital is a little harder to acquire these days?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I'm thankful as a representative of this company that I don't have to deal with that.
Right.
If we were if there was a capital acquisition as a part of this process, that would add a layer of complexity, and it wouldn't be as beneficial for the hospital. If there was a lengthy a costly implementation or a service contract and things like that, these would all be major barriers.
Yeah, and it's kind of to your point anyway. It's interesting when you're almost, depending on the length of the contract, you're giving the provider a glimpse of what can happen if they incorporate this in their practice, which I think is pretty cool.
Yeah.
So,
well, getting back to our betting on ourselves, we don't do the contracts.
Yeah.
So our contracts are 30-day out. So there's no. So
that's
not
it.
only is there,
so you're not locking in a provider in for a year,
No.
2 years or more.
No.
So you're betting that the experience that they're going to have and the impact they can make with their patients and their bottom line is going to be big enough to continue to have them coming back.
Absolutely. We literally carry all the burden, which speaks to how much confidence there is that once a hospital implements this into their practice, they're going to see so much value from both a quality of care perspective and the ROI perspective that we talked about, that they're going to leave it. They're going to use it.
Let me ask you another question. I have the greatest respect, even as a child, I was taught to revere salespeople, in the sense that everybody to some degree is selling something. The physician is selling you a treatment. So, one of the things that I wonder here is, if you're going to make any product or service successful, you've got to be able to market it.
Mm-hmm.
So how are you guys getting access to the decision makers where you can possibly get this product in the door?
Brent, that's a really good question. One of the best and the most highly utilized / awesome resources that we have is a panel of providers that join calls with us, and really they join our sales efforts. And these are providers that use it in practice at their hospitals. They can speak to our offering in a way that there's a credibility, because these are peer-to-peer conversations, right? And so they're having conversations with people that walk in their shoes, that not only deal with treating non-convulsive seizures, detecting and treating non-convulsive seizures, but all the other things that they deal with. And that's a perspective I don't have. My focus is very narrow, and it's about EEG and point of care EEG and even within EEG, it's singular focused on detecting and treating non-convulsive seizures. And so these peer-to-peer conversations are awesome. So I get to sit on, I facilitate them, and sometimes I'll use it as a carrot. If I feel like, getting back to your question about the sales plight, if I feel like things are growing stagnant, that's very appealing to somebody that needs to be a part of that process. Sure. To not talk to a salesperson. I don't mind saying that as a salesperson, and sometimes that I'll tee that up as the value is that, look, because part of my process is to you never stop at any amount of stakeholders that you have. We grind and grind and grind until we have everybody that could potentially weigh in on this, that they're involved. And so if I feel like there's some stagnancy within my sales cycle and I haven't done the peer-to-peer, which I go to it pretty quickly because that's an awesome resource, but I'll have a coach or a champion within the hospital to say, hey, do me a favor, let's propose a peer-to-peer. And so this individual knows that they're not going to get into a meeting or on a Zoom, whatever, with a salesperson.
Right.
They're going to talk to another intensivist, another neurointensivist, an emergency physician, a neuroservice line director, or another neurologist, right? So it's not sales speak. It's not coming from not that we're not valuable or any of that stuff. I'm not trying to be too disparaging about salespeople, but we're trying to make it as comfortable and as credible for the stakeholders that are going to be weighing in on this and assessing whether or not they're going to be bringing on Ceribell. And it's really the single best resource I've ever been able to use in my career as a salesperson.
I mean, it sounds like it would be, just because you're getting, they're getting feedback from people that are actually using this on the ground.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to put you on the spot here, hit you with a couple random questions that have nothing to do with Ceribell. You up for it?
All right, perfect. Let's go.
You can teleport right now immediately to any place on planet Earth. Where is it?
Right now?
Right now.
I have baseball practice for our Little League team
That's
here.
True.
In,
That's true.
Not even an hour and a half. I can't go anywhere.
Coach Ian takes over. You can still teleport anywhere.
Okay, perfect. All right. So assuming Little League practice is taken care of, and I actually play too. I have a game on Sunday, so I'm stuck here in Phoenix this weekend. But if I could teleport anywhere right now, let's see, end of February. Where do I want to be? End of February. That's a really good question. Okay, this is where I would go.
Let's hear it.
It's Northern Lights.
Yeah.
And so I have been to Reykjavik once. It was during late December. In fact, I saw the Northern Lights on Christmas Eve.
Pretty awesome.
Back in, when was that? Like 2009-ish. I think it was 2009. Yeah. And so maybe I wouldn't go back to Reykjavik, but I would head out that way. And it could be somewhere in Scandinavia, we'll say. I'm not too picky, right? And get out there, bring the warm winter gear out, obviously, and post up under the Northern Lights.
I like it. Favorite book all time?
Oh, favorite book. I have to admit, I'm a huge music fan, as you know, and also a sports fan. So most of my reading comes from, ESPN.com and Pitchfork and things like that. But I'm going to take the easy way out here. I'm going to give you my favorite book that has helped me professionally. And it's a book called Sales EQ.
Okay.
And
I've not heard of that one.
It's great. It's by an author named Jeb Blount. And I've been at a conference where he has presented a lot of his ideologies. And the single reason why I love Sales EQ is because it takes the best elements of a lot of other sales processes that have been taught into one. I literally feel that if I were to have read Sales EQ, right out of college as a young salesperson, I may not need to read all the other books I ended up reading over the past 20 plus years, because it really factors in, a lot of it. And it's much more, it's funny that it's called Sales EQ, because Sales EQ are one of the 4 Qs that he addresses in that book. There's IQ, there's AQ, there's TQ, and he does a good job of covering all of them. But then, like I said, more importantly, I like to be efficient and productive as it relates to seeking, professional help and a lot of these sales processes that I've been taught, and that one captures everything.
No, definitely check that out. Last question: I know you're a music guy. Best concert ever.
So I've had this question so much, and I always go back to my first show. So my first show was on Halloween night, 1992. Okay, and this show is actually really pretty well known. It was made into a video that did really well for this artist, and that was Danzig, White Zombie, and Caius.
No way. All right, there you go. It's a whole different side of you.
Yeah. And I'm telling you, well, I'm a big Glenn Danzig fan, and becoming a big White Zombie / Rob Zombie fan. And then the third band, so the one that played when it was still light out and they got their 20-minute set. This band Caius actually became one of those bands that never had huge commercial success, but it's one of those if you know bands. And the lead guitarist of that band was Josh Homme, who went on to form Queens of the Stone Age.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And but definitely a fan of Queens of the Stone Age too. So, so I was 19 years old, Halloween night, 1992, Irvine Meadows Amphitheater. I actually did a speech for Toastmasters recently on that show, so I'm pretty well versed in everything about that night. But there was a video that came out of that end up putting Danzig in another stratosphere commercially, and it was just a perfect night, and it happens to be my first show. I've probably seen over 200 since, but that was the best.
Awesome. Well, Nate, hey, thank you so much for joining me to talk about this. I think this kind of stuff really excites me because the creativity, the innovation that happens across industries. I'm just a firm believer that all this stuff sort of moves the human experience forward, and to the extent that people are out there creating products and services and devices that help with that. I love having these conversations, particularly for some of these younger companies that are doing cool stuff. So
awesome.
Yeah. Thanks for taking some time this afternoon.
Sure. I enjoyed this.
It was great.
I'll
Thank
be
you.
back next Friday.
All right.
We'll talk about something else.
We'll have a 6-pack of beer here waiting as well.
Sounds good.
This has been fantastic, Nate. You know, here's the thing. Brent never said what year it had to be where if you wanted to teleport yourself anywhere you wanted to go, you could go right back to
Good
that
point.
concert. I'm just saying, you know. Just
there you go.
Yeah.
Hey, this has been a fantastic podcast. I know that we need to wrap up. Brent, thank you so much for bringing Nate on. Nate, thank you for spending time with Brent. Great content, amazing stuff being developed. So thank you so much for that. And of course, our last thank you goes to you, the listening audience. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening to the Smart Money Simplified podcast with Brent Mekosh. If you have not subscribed to the podcast yet, please click the subscribe now button below. This way, when Brent comes out with a new podcast, it'll show up directly on your listening device. And we humbly ask that you share this podcast, rate it, and leave a review, as this actually does help others find the show. Again, thank you so much for listening today. For everyone at MP Advisors, this is Eric Johnson reminding you to live your best day every day. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Smart Money Simplified Podcast. Have any questions about topics covered during the show? Visit www.smartmoneysimplified.com or give us a call at 602-255-0555. Don't forget to click the follow button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the hosts and/or guests and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Raymond James Financial Services Incorporated. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional financial advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service providers with any questions you may have regarding your individual situation. Securities are offered through Raymond James Financial Services Incorporated, member FINRA, and SIPC. Investment advisory services offered through Raymond James Financial Services Advisors Incorporated, MP Advisors, LLC, is not a broker/dealer and is independent of Raymond James Financial Services.